are these people?
I need to send you his
Okay.
we'll call it a memoir, but he's done a couple of books at least. So
Sure.
I should send you one.
Yeah, I'll take
Maybe
one.
maybe that could be a Christmas gift, whatever.
Yeah.
So yes, we are huge fans. Well, I've turned on Reef.
Yeah.
My goal is to turn on INN to Kwame Turé. No, and to be fair, I don't know a lot about him. I'm beginning to learn more about him, but the more I'm kind of immersing in his thought patterns, so to speak. The more I've been really intrigued by him and just a lot of the stuff that he was saying right now, back in the 60s, all the way through the 90s, it's still kind of pertinent today. And I think a lot of the issues that we kind of talk about as, kind of more novel that there were people, not just him, but he was definitely one of those prominent thought leaders back in the day that were talking about this back then. So I just always kind of say, here, if we want to talk about revolution, we have to study the people who came before us and kind of listen to what they were saying and what they were talking about, that we can kind of take example from and kind of build upon what they were doing, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel like we tend to do. But yeah, I mean, so anyway, Reef did find this article last week, I believe. He DM'd it to me.
Yes.
And I was like, okay, we definitely have to do this in light of a Substack article kind of featured Kwame Turé. And then I've talked about Kwame Turé several times in my rants, on the network. So surprise, surprise, from The Guardian, revealed how UK targeted American civil rights leader in covert campaign, which honestly, this should be surprising considering, MLK, Malcolm X, Fred Hamilton, this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone here, honestly. So honestly, in a way, I feel like that's kind of badass, in the sense that not only he was targeted, here, but he was targeted, overseas, I think is especially badass. But I think it just kind of shows and I think we kind of made this association with Chris Smalls in the Substack, if you're talking revolution, if you're talking shit that establishment doesn't like, they don't like you. So, so obviously Kwame, definitely with his thought patterns, attracted a lot of people, and unfortunately within government, and even more especially overseas, that he caught a lot of attention. So so let's get into it, shall we?
Yeah.
Hopefully, and you have to remove your screen so I can read it, Reef, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
And the one at the bottom too. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So the British government targeted American civil rights leader Stokely Carmichael and sought to weaken the Black Power movement with covert disinformation campaigns, recently declassified documents have revealed. The effort was the work of a secret unit known as the Information Research Department, based in London and part of the Foreign Office, which created and distributed literature from fake sources as part of a broader effort to destabilize Cold War enemies. Though focused primarily on the Soviet Union and China, left-wing liberation groups and leaders the UK saw as threats to its interests, the discoveries revealed the RARD from the late 60s sought to counter more diverse targets too. We can see a large-scale attempt to shape events overseas, but one that was moving away from communism and targeting whole new areas. This shows the breadth, scope, and scale of British covert information operations, said Rory Cormack, an expert in the history of subversion and intelligence, who found the material when researching his recent book, How to Stage a Coup, and 10 Other Lessons from the World of Secret Statecraft. The effort against Carmichael, a firebrand orator who had traveled to West Africa in part to escape harassment by US law enforcement agencies, aimed to portray the prominent Black Power leader as a foreign interloper in Africa who was contemptuous of the inhabitants of the continent. Based mainly in Guinea from July 1969, the 28-year-old activist had become a vocal advocate of social Pan-African ideologies, which worried British officials. The documents show the RID created a fake West African organization called the Black Power, Africa's Heritage Group, which produced a pamphlet calling Carmichael an unbidden prophet from America who had no place on the continent. Enough is enough. White Stokely must go and do his thing elsewhere, read the pamphlet, alleging Carmichael was weaving a bloody trail of chaos in the name of Pan-Africanism and was controlled by Kwame Turé, the independence leader and former president of Ghana, who had been disposed in a coup in 1966. The RD's effort to not attack Carmichael as pro-Soviet or communist stooge, a hitherto frequent line of attack. Instead, the unit sought to portray its target as a traitor to other Black Power activists with a patronizing view to African peoples. By coming to Africa, Carmichael had deserted the cause in the US, which needs him more than we do, and had been arrogant in preaching Black Power to a continent where it already truly belongs, the pamphlet said. It also claimed Carmichael was a burning zealot who seemed to imagine Africans as savages and compared him unfavorably with other radical activists who have recently arrived on the continent from the US, such as Eldridge Cleaver, an early leader of the Black Panthers, who is living in Algeria.
Okay.
We are struggling of formulating our own plans for our part in the struggle for equal rights and freedom for the Black man everywhere. And when we were launching Black Power, it will be our own brand, African Power, and not the African-American brainchild Stokely is trying to oppose on us, the fake statement read. The smear operation against Carmichael received enthusiastic endorsement from officials within the RDR and elsewhere in the British government, including in the Foreign Office West African Department. It came amid rising concern in Whitehall about the Black Power movement elsewhere in the world too. The RID was particularly worried by the movement's potential influence in the Caribbean. By the way, just as context, Stokely originally was from Trinidad, so there's the context there. He was born and raised there and then moved to the States, when he was 11, something like that. In February 1969, the RID learned of a Black Power conference to be held in Bermuda the following August and decided that rather than ban the event, it should attempt to discredit it. British intelligence services were asked for information on Black Power leaders and any evidence of Soviet, Cuban, or Guyanese links to the movement. There was only available from US intelligence services that had begun investigating links between Black radicalism in the Caribbean and advocates of Black Power in the US from around 1968. The RRD then prepared a series of articles for distribution to newspapers in the Caribbean and elsewhere. These accused the Black Power movement from being exploited by Havana and claimed the forthcoming conference would ruin Bermuda economically. The RRD also prepared and distributed an article about Black Power leaders targeting Trinidad. This suggested that communists were behind Black Power aspirations on the island and that outside powers operated with the collusion of ambitious locals seeking their own ends. Some tactics in Bermuda were rejected for fear of stoking racial tensions, and local officials in the Caribbean were not supportive of the campaign. There were limits to what the RID was prepared to do. In the Caribbean, the concern was that racial tension could lead to riots and distribution of tourism, so the wider economy. In general, the RID was happy to insinuate something without evidence, but not without rightly lying, Cormac said. In 1969, the RID also created a new fake group, the Organization of African Students for African Power. This was supposedly based in East Germany and adopted contemporary radical New Left ideas, proclaiming a plague on both the capitalist West and the Soviet bloc.
Gotcha.
The RID felt this provided a better platform to damage opponents rather than the dated nationalist approach, while being difficult to trace back to Britain because many similar groups had generally sprung up in the late 1960s. The group attempted to link a wave of assassinations in Africa to the Soviets. The British were not alone in such tactics. The KGB committed significant resources to disinformation campaigns throughout the Cold War and achieved some significant successes. One pamphlet produced by the Soviet service reported accurate American statistics and real cases of race crimes in order to turn African audiences against the US. It was made to look like it had been run by an African-American organization agitated against the Ku Klux Klan. The CRA built extensive networks across sub-Saharan Africa and used cultural ambassadors such as Louis Armstrong as a Trojan horse for intelligence gathering. The agency continued to be interested in Carmichael after his flight from the US in 1969 and wrote typescript memos on his travels abroad during a period when he had dropped from public view. A summary of activities released by the agency in 2007 revealed. The UK effort was a lot smaller than that of the Americans or the Soviets and more restrained too, but was broad in scope. The UK was doing this all over the world, Cormac said. Information operations were seen as a force multiplier. It is clear that there was recognition that we were small and in decline, but this was a clever way of maintaining a global role on the cheap. Okay.
Okay.
Thoughts?
So Cliff notes that for everyone.
I'm gonna go back a second, but
yeah.
Any thoughts?
I mean, it's interesting that they, pegged him with, he was a communist sympathizer, right?
Sound familiar?
Yeah, absolutely. I know a particular man, Omali Yeshitela of the Uhuru movement, just recently had to deal with, our foreign office, affecting him. So through drones right by his wife's head. So, I mean, how many times you got to go through this with Fred Hampton, with Malcolm, with, King, with,
right.
Pick a black dot leader.
Right. But I think it's funny, like, they try to discredit him in part of the fact that he decided to emigrate to West Africa. And, almost as if, oh, you're not a real one, because if you were a real one, you should be here in the US and fighting for your people. And you know what? Like, actually, in thinking about this, as someone who has lived very briefly in East Africa for a short time, like over a decade ago, I think I've said this on the show before, and I think it bears repeating. I get it, because as a Black person, especially being in America, and kind of being immersed with white supremacy and racism and all of that, like, I feel like if you live in America or if you live in Europe as a Black person and you don't necessarily know any better, you're not going to know any better of like the reality that you live in, and you're just kind of like, whatever, like, not always, but I feel like oftentimes that can happen. Like, I remember when I first moved, well, I was there for a short time, but I lived in Uganda for, I think it was 5 months, in the bush, mind you. And then I remember like halfway through my trip, I was in Uganda and I lived like an hour and a half from the capital. And like one weekend, the group I was with and we decided to go into town, just for a day, because at that point we were like, like, oh God, like we live in the bush, like, we can't do shit, like there's nothing to do, we can't even have pizza or whatever without having to cook it from scratch and all that, which basically would take all day, that type of thing. So it was just like, look, we're just going into town for the day just to go swimming and like enjoy some American food, and like whatever. And I remember being at the pool, just sitting there. And I just kind of explained this to the group I was with the group I was with, there was all white people, and it was me. But everyone else obviously was Uganda, so it was pretty much everyone else that was Black. And then I kind of made a comment basically saying, there are no white people here other than you guys. And I didn't say that like as a racist idea or anything like that. It just kind of came out of my mouth.
Right.
And then I think for me, like two things kind of stood out to me in an instant. The first thing that stood out was like, for the first time, or one of the rare times in my life, I wasn't conscious about being Black. you know, and realizing how suppressive that weight is, you know, for people of color, but speaking as a Black person, like in America. And then the other thing that that stuck with me from then was realizing in a lot of ways how privileged I really am, and how racism and capitalism and imperialism and all the isms here kind of blind you, especially as a person of color, of that privilege. And so the idea of Kwame Turé kind of moving to Africa, you know, I get it, because not to say you're escaping, because I think that's the, you know, like it alluded to this in the article, he was escaping America. First of all, again, he's, you know, from the Caribbean. So if, you know, if anything, you know, he, like, you can't necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily say he was escaping. I would argue that he was kind of returning to his roots, you know, of sorts.
Well, and
But
they've asked this of like James Baldwin and stuff too. Like
right,
he gets asked this too. Like, why did you leave? It's like, why
right,
wouldn't I leave?
right.
You
And
know,
especially like, you know, we're gonna have I'll say this now. We're gonna do like a special INN News, you know, show on Monday with another show, DJ Joe Nice, also international Black man as myself, who
sounds
has
like a great
said,
movie
you know,
title.
like, who has said, you know, like, if he has a chance, he will leave this country. Shit. Like, I would too, like, if it wasn't for my mother that, you know, like, who I have to kind of watch out for, given, you know, how, you know, just mental, like, health issues or whatever, I probably have my health issues as well. Like, I would be gone. But in saying for Touré, you know, like, I feel like in going to Africa for him, one, it was kind of like a returning to a place where you somewhat belong, but then
Mm-hmm.
like, not to say you're going to escape all the capitalism and all of that, because that exists in Africa too, but you can make the argument it's easier to deal with people who look like you,
Yeah.
number one. But then number two, and this is what I also kind of discovered, and I think in a lot of ways this was kind of my origin story politically, being in Uganda for 5 months helped me realize how shit this country really is as far as the basic stuff that we should just offer just because. Like the idea, like, and I've said this before, you know, the idea like in the bush, you can have a child, go to the hospital, have a baby. Basically, you're paying for the hospital stay. And at the time, you're basically paying, you know, at least the Wentis wife who had the child while I was there, like the equivalent of like $10 for a hospital stay. You're basically paying for the bed.
Yeah.
Whereas here, even with insurance, you're paying like thousands of dollars just to give birth, you know?
Yeah.
You know, so like the idea, like I had to go over to Africa to kind of discover like how shit it is, you know, is really telling. And I think for me, in thinking about Touré, to make that association in Africa and being like, yes, like you're able to make those comparisons, but also you're able to kind of identify more, if anything, with Black people here. Because it's always portrayed like in the media with Africa, you know, like Africans are poor and whatever else, and like African Americans, like, or people in the Black people in the West, oh, we may go through shit, but compared to Africa, you know, we're doing way much better. At the end of the day, you know, Black is Black, and like we're all going through the same shit. You know, it's just different levels of it depending on where you are. And so I feel like, especially if you look at Touré, with his, you know, in kind of the lectures that we have definitely seen, he makes those comparisons of like what it's like in Africa, but also basically being like, it's the same shit that we're going through here in America. So he was
Mm.
able to make those comparisons readily because he lived there, but he was able to kind of say, at the end of the day, Black is Black, and this is an issue among Black people in the diaspora, period. There's no difference necessarily in between where you live, but the idea of what capitalism in the world is doing. So all of that, and I went on a tangent. That was probably my rant for tonight. Sorry, but not sorry.
You're
But
good.
all of that to say,
Preach it.
you know, like this was probably why he was targeted.
Yeah.
Because he was able to make those connections, you know, not just like with African Americans here, but within the Caribbean and within Africa. And I said this before, you know, with George Floyd, you know, that was an international movement, especially among Black people. And when the NBA was preparing to strike, you know, like people forget the NBA is watched all over the world. And the idea of the NBA going on strike would have been huge as far as Black Lives Matter. Who stopped it? Obama, right? Like the very thing that could have mobilized Black people around the world, Obama stopped. And so, you know, so the idea that Turé was able to make those associations with the diaspora as far as the reality of Blackness, no matter where you are in the world, yeah, I get it was dangerous.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think especially, you know, like for the UK, again, this was what's in here.
Well, in this section,
you know?
with the CIA working, of course, they're working together on this. Like, you know, we got to have all our spies spy with each other. Using Louis Armstrong, right? And people find it weird if we call a celebrity now, like, you know, Julia Child was a spy. Like, she'd make you a bouillabaisse and like take your microfiche. Like, you know what I'm saying?
It's so interesting, the international aspect too.
Yeah.
I think especially when you talk about like, because like I went to, before I was like a citizen of a European citizen, I had the flu in Croatia and I went to the doctor and it cost me $60.
Right.
Colin's right. Like in any, like the only place that they'll like really fuck you and bankrupt you over being like sick is here, because we're like we're absolutely fucking sadistic, and it's anti-people. It's not even anti-worker. It's anti-people.
Yeah.
Right. And so yeah, so all of that, and I'm sorry, I have to go back to your previous segment for a second, Greg, because like, you know, like because it relates to this. You know,
yeah, no,
like,
it does.
You know, but the idea of like, but we're in getting to the root of the problem. Like, why in the fuck are we concerned about clean water in the U.S.? Why? Like, this shouldn't be an issue. You know, like we shouldn't be in this situation where, like, communities of color, especially, have to worry about the water that they drink. Not here. And like all this talk about all this reform as far as, oh, we're going to give money just for like, we're going to take care of you and all like, and all that kind of, it's okay. But like, can we just fix the infrastructure where this doesn't happen in our country, please?
Yeah. Would be nice.
Healthcare, please.
Like, why is this an issue? And going back to like, you know, the Build Back Better bill, like, doesn't address any of this shit.
No.
So it's like, so all of that to say, especially in light of Turé being able to use his, you know, his rhetoric in order to essentially mobilize the diaspora, yeah, understandably he was going to be targeted, you know? So, because imagine what would happen if like the Black Power movement was mobilized, you know, here, the Caribbean, and in Europe, and in Africa.
Yeah.
You know, obviously he resonated with Black people throughout the world that, you know, like was meaningful enough for the UK to take notice, you know? So, and honestly, you know, like, you know, I think he's just so underrated, you know, but like people kind of make the association with him and John Lewis, who, and I'm going to say this right now, he was a sellout. I said it, you know, I don't care. You know, you can come at me on Twitter or whatever you want, but John Lewis, like, he gets all the props or whatever, and like, but he was a sellout. You know, he went establishment. you know? So like Turé was very principled and I felt like in order to remain principled that he had to leave in
Yeah.
order to maintain that principle. So for me, having kind of done it myself, I get why he did it, but then I also understand like you're able to make easier connections to what's happening in this country if you leave and kind of
Right.
see culture, different cultures, and being able to make that comparison, being like, oh crap, like they do things differently and maybe better here than they do in the US. Like, why can we do that here?
Yeah.
You know, like every time like I go to London, you know, like as far as the infrastructure, every time, especially with public transportation, is always better. Like I know they complain, you know, about it all the time because they have to deal with it. But like, you know, but every time like I take the tube or whatever, they're always like renovating it, always like trying to make it faster, always trying to make it more efficient. Yeah, it's expensive as fuck, but like you don't have to worry about the tube breaking down at all or anything like that. You know,
Yeah.
here, like when you take the metro, like it's just shit. And it's a newer system.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know, but
As
yeah,
as
I think
as Misty would say,
We're fucked.
I agree.
basically, I agree. But
Double.
all of that to say, you know, like, and as we said, you know, like, you know, if the establishment is chummy with you, then you're not a threat.
Yeah.
And we've said this many times. So the fact that, like, again, you know, with Turé, like, it's not in this country he was targeted. I'm sure he was, but like in the UK, like that's
Yeah.
especially like badass.
I mean,
This is-
You know?
look at Julian Assange. He's
Yeah.
an Australian man. As soon as you become any sort of threat to the Western Empire, you're dead. They're gonna fucking kill
Who are
you.
these people?
Yeah. They immediately start asking.
Right.
You know? I mean, I just feel like this isn't the way you get change to happen.
Notice me, senpai. Notice me.
It's just not how you do that. Like, but anyway,